Hi, folks. Thanks for joining me this afternoon at PSConf. Hopefully, you're looking forward to a session about Azure Automation. If not, maybe you're not in the right place. But before we get started, I want to take a second to thank our sponsors. These folks are downstairs in the expo area by where the snacks are. So please do stop by, chat to them about why they're here, what products they have, what services they have. But most importantly, thank them for sponsoring. Without them, we couldn't all be here enjoying sessions and networking and mingling in Sweden. This is me. My name's Jess Pomfret. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a data platform engineer. I work for a company called Data Masterminds. And we actually have a kind of sister company called DevOps Masterminds that I also do quite a lot of work for. I started life as a SQL Server DBA, and I found PowerShell as a way of automating things that I didn't want to do more than once. And then I ended up in this kind of niche between the data world and the PowerShell world. More recently, I've been doing a lot of DevOps stuff, Azure stuff, general automation. I'm also an open source contributor, and I've been involved in the DBA Tools project for a long time, and the DBA Checks module. DBA Checks is like, how many people know what DBA Tools is? Yeah, that's awesome. So DBA Checks is like DBA Tools plus Pester, and it creates this like infrastructure testing module, which is also worth checking out. And just recently, I've been helping on the Fabric Tools module, which me and the bearded fellow in the back will talk about tomorrow afternoon. I'm passionate about automation, proper football, and fitness, but the most important stuff on this slide is my contact information. If you have questions or you want to get in contact with me, you can find me on LinkedIn, you can email me, and my website is in the middle. There's some blog posts and stuff on there. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, which means I love doing stuff like this. I love giving back to the community, talking, sharing code, and hanging out, basically. So let's get into the session today. Now, I said to Copilot, please make me a picture of someone writing PowerShell in a server room. And I got a woman, and I was really excited about that. And I said to Rob, Copilot thinks women work in server rooms. This is great. And he put it in, and he got a man. And I was like, So maybe it knows like who I am as the context. But anyway, it was cool. And you can see she's writing some average PowerShell code. AI is not good with words, right? So putting words on a picture is never going to work. But the point is here, in the old days, and maybe not really that long ago, we used to have on-prem servers, right? Virtual machines everywhere. We had an operating system. We could write PowerShell code, save it on the C drive, and then run it as scheduled tasks really easily. But then our servers and our processes were sucked into the cloud, or migrated is the official term, and things became serverless. Like, what does that even mean? There's still servers somewhere, right? But what it means is instead of having virtual machines for all of our applications, we've got Azure services. We don't have the infrastructure. We've lost some of that control layer where we might want to run our PowerShell. The quiz I mentioned. Now all of our stuff is running serverlessly in Azure services in the cloud, like we're using storage accounts. We're using app services, web apps. We're using Databricks, SQL Managed Instance, SQL Database, Data Factory, or Azure Kubernetes Service, right? All of these are serverless offerings or app offerings. There's no infrastructure. There's nowhere for us to easily schedule simple PowerShell scripts to automate our infrastructure and our processes. So where will our PowerShell live now? Well, this is really going to depend on how much control we need, right? And so we're going to go through some options. We're going to want to think about how much control we need, whether we want to run ad hoc code, or whether we want it to be scheduled or triggered by events, and who's writing it. Are business folks writing these processes, this PowerShell, to get stuff done, or is it IT folks like us? So our first option is Cloud Shell, which is great for running ad hoc code. Basically, if you're in the Azure portal, you get this Cloud Shell window at the bottom. It's a browser-based shell. It's got Bash or PowerShell options. And the Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell modules are already pre-installed and pre-authenticated. So the resources I can see in the top of this portal screen, I can access easily in the bottom half in the shell. perfect for ad hoc code. It's also really useful if you need to do something quickly on your phone, right? You can go to the portal, you can get a PowerShell window. Pretty cool. But if we need something more than ad hoc code, we can then move towards our serverless execution options. And these can be triggered by schedules or events. And this is kind of where the PowerShell, where this presentation is going to come back to. But to hit on these quickly, we've got Azure Functions, Azure Automation, which is our focus for today's session, and Logic Apps. All of these enable us to run PowerShell and code in a serverless fashion, which means there's no infrastructure to worry about. But maybe that's not enough control, right? So these three options, there's different reasons why we might use one or the other. And I think Azure Functions and Azure Automation are pretty close together in the things that you might want to use them for. Logic Apps is our no-code, low-code option, and it is better for like business folks that want to automate processes rather than IT folks. But Azure Functions are a great way of running event-driven code. So if like blob storage, a file drops into blob storage, you can have Azure Function run immediately based on that trigger. Whereas Azure Automation, it's better for running like more complicated administration scripts. As I mentioned, Azure Functions, event-driven. Azure Automation, we can schedule them or we can call them. We can trigger them from REST endpoints and a few other triggers. But functions are really if you're going to want to be handling event-driven workloads. Azure Functions are massively scalable, right? So you can write a function that is able to scale to all kinds of magnitudes of REST endpoint requests, right? Whereas Azure Automation is better for like one script that's going to automate some infrastructure. The cost of all of these services is pretty cheap. Cost per second of execution for Azure Functions and cost per minute of job execution for Azure Automation. You have to be doing some pretty crazy stuff, like a ton of executions or long executions of code to really rack up any serious Azure spend here. And if you are running really long-running scripts, then maybe this isn't the right solution for you, right? It's all about choosing the right tool for the job. And all three of these are good options. Basically, when you come up with your scenario, think about which one of these is good for which thing, and then pick the right tool for the job. But what if that's not enough control? What if I really need that infrastructure? I need that OS to be able to schedule my scripts. Well, nothing's stopping you from building a VM in Azure or in AWS or Google Cloud or wherever you might host your cloud solutions. Creating a VM gives you absolute full control, same as if you run a virtual machine or an on-prem system in your own data center. You can save that script on the C drive, and you can schedule it with Windows Task Scheduler, right? The benefit here is you're also potentially on a domain-controlled, domain-joined machine, right? So you can interact with on-prem applications more easily, and that authentication piece could be easier for like managing certain tasks. However, this could be more costly, right? If I need to run one PowerShell script and I need a whole Azure VM to do that, that's not going to be a cost-effective solution. And I need to take responsibility for patching, maintenance, security for that whole VM. Yes, some of that can be automated with like the IaaS extension in Azure, but it's something that you need to consider where our serverless options you didn't need to. But this is unleashing PowerShell in the cloud with Azure Automation, right? So let's focus on that tool for today. When we think of Azure Automation, there are a few pieces and parts we need to be able to use it. The first thing is the account. And this is basically the container where we can configure it to be exactly what we need. We'll take a look at that in the demos. Within our account, we can have Runbooks, which is where our code is going to live. We can create runtime environments, which configure the exact environment for that runbook to run in. So you can use PowerShell or Python. You can specify the certain PowerShell version or Python version you want, and you can specify which modules you want to be included. You can also use hybrid workers. So in my control kind of flow there, I said Azure VMs was a good way to interact with on-prem solutions. If you don't need the VM, you could use Azure Automation with a hybrid worker, which basically puts it into your infrastructure. You basically run your Azure Automation code on-prem. Azure Automation also has a concept of variables, which is really cool. If you have code that you want to use multiple times across different runbooks, or variables that want to be set specifically for like your organization name, you're going to use that the same in every runbook. You can set them at the account level, and then they can be used in all your runbooks. Also, Azure Automation does have source control integration. So you can save your runbooks to GitHub or Azure DevOps, and that push can trigger the update to your runbooks. We won't look at that today, but that is something that if you're going to productionize this, I would recommend that highly. Just to touch on the runtime environments again, you get quite a lot built in as system generated. Runtime environments, you can't change those, they just are what they are. But what you can do is create your own with any of these versions of PowerShell or PowerShell 7.4. You can specify the Azure modules or the AZ CLI version, and you can also install your own modules. Let's just hop back to the hybrid runbook workers again, because these are worth just mentioning. If you're not using a hybrid runbook worker, you're using the Azure Cloud Runner, which is the default if you don't set anything else up. The hybrid runbook worker is running on-premise or in an Azure VM, whereas the Cloud Runner is just running natively in Azure. If you need to manage on-prem resources, or you need to be within your domain, that hybrid runbook worker will be perfect. Whereas if you're automating Azure tasks, you might as well use the Azure Runner. Again, the Azure Runner is limited to Azure services that it can access, whereas the hybrid runbook worker will be within your network. You can access local network resources. Performance-wise, the hybrid runbook worker will perform with whatever spec you give it, right? If you give it the smallest VM you've ever seen, it's going to perform pretty poorly. But if you need extra power, you can scale that VM up. You'll pay the price for it, obviously, because it's in Azure, but you can use all that power. And actually, if you have a VM or something on-prem, you won't pay the price for having a bigger VM Azure-wise, right? It will be your on-prem data center. The setup complexity, the Azure Cloud Runner is just built in. It's just ready to go. That's what we'll use today in our demos. The other one, the hybrid runbook worker, which is just an absolute mouthful. You obviously need to create a VM or have a VM and then configure that connectivity. Finally, a use case for either of them, if you need to be integrated with your on-prem AD and you need to be managing local resources, you're going to choose the hybrid option. If you're automating Azure VM scaling or Azure tasks, stick with the Azure Cloud Runner. Some use cases for what I've used Azure Automation for. I have a client that needs to call an API to delete records from like a SaaS database. And they were manually doing this through Postman, like updating the application ID and then running the HTTP request over and over again. Like they do it once a week. And it would take them forever because they only did it once a week. So we automated this and just run it daily in an Azure Automation runbook. It just loops through. It's PowerShell, right? You all know how to write PowerShell. Loop through a bunch of applications, call the endpoint, job done. Another interesting one that I worked on recently was MongoDB. Another client is using MongoDB Atlas, and with Atlas you can configure it to scale up and down, which is nice. Save some money when you're not using it. Unfortunately, the overnight processing would finish up about 3 a.m. and then the 4 hours of slow time would happen. And it'd be like, oh, you don't need all this resource. I'll scale down. Like right before 8 a.m. when my day's workload starts, right? So with Azure Automation, we wrote some code that will basically manually scale up and down based on the schedule that we know, right, as business people. So that was a cool one. And actually ended up saving some money, right? Because Azure Automation is pretty cheap. Mongo is not cheap if you have it on a larger tier. So another one I really like is creating Azure DevOps tickets on a schedule. There's no built-in way to create Azure DevOps tickets for every sprint. So if you have tasks you need to do every month or every quarter, you can create a process and use Azure Automation to create those tickets. Today's example, we're going to talk about keeping your Azure tenant tidy. So I mentioned some of my work for DevOps Masterminds. One of the things we quite often do is we'll go in and we'll help clients with their Azure tenants and their Azure spend. And we'll find all kinds of disks that are unattached. They've just been hanging out. You're just paying for them. All kinds of IP addresses that aren't used anymore. And we'll say, do you need these? Like, should we tidy them up, save some money? Well, we can use Azure Automation to look for those things on a schedule every 2 weeks, and then basically create that report of things we should tidy up. So with that, we'll get to the demos. So as I mentioned, the demo is all about keeping our Azure tenant clean and tidy. We're going to look at this in 2 parts. First, what do we need in Azure? What do we need to create to be able to create a runbook? And then secondly, we'll deploy some code, some PowerShell code. So, one thing I didn't think about this crazy resolution is that my mouse cursor is like this big. If you can see that, it's impressive. Okay, so I'm going to look at some Terraform code to start with. What I'll do is I will just navigate to this folder. And I will run Terraform plan. While that is running, we'll talk through it. So Terraform infrastructure as code. If I'm going to do something, wow, that cursor is tiny. If I'm going to do something, I'm going to deploy infrastructure. I'm probably going to use infrastructure as code, which is going to create declarative code of how my environment should look, right? And it's really easy to do that in Azure. You can use Terraform, you can use Bicep, up to you. But basically, all I'm doing is I'm defining that I would like an Azure resource group, which is a container to put our Azure resources in. And then I'm going to create an Azure Automation account. Oh boy, wasn't holding control. And I'm going to give it a name, a resource group. But the important stuff here is this. I'm going to give it a managed identity. Managed identities in Azure basically gives my automation account an identity that I can then give it permissions to things, right? So I can say, you may go look at storage accounts, or you may go do this. So we're going to add that to the resource. This didn't seem to do anything. Why can't I see this? Oh, not in the folder. Did I not run CD? Hold on, folks. Okay, let's see if this is better. We'll just let this run a second, and what it should do is basically create the plan for what we need to create. So a resource group in Azure and a Azure Automation account. Let's make sure we're connected to the internet. We are. Plan. What should have happened is that should have happened while I was talking about it, but that's okay. Also in this Terraform folder, if you've never used Terraform before, you can see I've got variables file, which basically describes things that I could pass in to change based on each time I run this. And I've then got a tfvars file, which is my definition of the variables right now. Okay, this is better. You can see that it's come back and said exactly that. The plan is to add 2 things, the resource group and the automation account. And because I did out tf plan, what I can do is I can do a Terraform apply with that specific plan that I created, which means exactly what we reviewed will be created. If you just run Terraform apply, it will run it against your configuration again, comparing the state file, seeing what state you're already in. But you'll get what the apply will be whatever differences there are in the plan right then. Whereas if I syn the plan, I'm saying deploy that. So you can see my resource group is being created. It basically will output onto the screen once everything is created and we're ready to go. Also in the main Terraform file, before we move on from Terraform, you can create runbooks, right? So I created the Azure Automation account. You can also create runbooks, but there is no way to tie this runbook in Terraform to the runtime environment that I also want to create. So we're going to skip that from here for now. You can see that my Terraform's created, so I should have those resources in Azure when we get there. So let's now go ahead and look at the CLI. Because we can also manage this stuff with the Azure CLI, I'm going to set a couple of variables here. And I'm going to create myself a runtime environment. So AZ Automation runtime environment create. I'm going to say use PowerShell version 7.4. And I'm going to define the default packages. I want to use the AZ or the Azure PowerShell modules 12.3.0. So I can control exactly what that environment's going to look like. Then I can create a package. So AZ Automation runtime environment package create. If you saw my session last year, you'll know that I'm a big fan of PSHTML. And what I can do is I can pull that from the PowerShell gallery, a specific version, into my runtime environment. So it will be available for my scripts to use. Now, I could create an automation runbook again in the Azure CLI. I couldn't find a way to tie this to the runtime environment either. It would only tie it to the default system-made PowerShell runtime. So we're forced to go to the portal, but it's not a bad thing because we'll also take a look at what we've got out there. And if I refresh this page, you can see I've got my Azure Automation account, PSConfEU 001. And you can see some information about it, but on the left over here, we've got Runbooks. And at the moment, I've got none. If I check my runtime environments, you can see I've got PowerShell 7.4, and it is the only one that is not a system-generated runtime. Let's go to Runbooks, and we will create a runbook. We're going to create a new one, which just makes a blank file called Azure Cleanup. You can also upload a file, or you can browse from the gallery. I'm going to choose PowerShell, and now I get the option to choose my runtime environment, which I can pick the one I specified, right, with the specific PowerShell modules that I want, including PSHTML. Let's select that. Whenever you're doing this, make sure you put a useful description in here, like so, but actually useful. And then also tags. Tags are so important in Azure for documentation and for governance, right? I would recommend you have some kind of tagging strategy in your organization. I'm going to at least add the environment of production and the owner. So this means if there's a problem, this is production, we should probably fix it. And also, when it's been sat dormant for a while and we're wondering if we can clean it up, we can come yell at me and be like, what is this? Do something with it. If you have resources out there without tags, you're going to be chasing people around being like, hey, do you know what this might be? And be like, oh yeah, so-and-so made that about 6 years ago, and I think it was for this. And you're like, well, they left 5 years ago. So who manages it now, right? Adding tags, add who the resource should be billed to, add the department that created it, work out what's useful to you. All right, here's our runbook. It's just empty code, which is fine. We are going to add the code through VS Code. Remember I mentioned the source control integration. We could save the code, push it to GitHub, have it get put there automatically. But I also want to show you the Azure Automation VS Code extension. If I just refresh this, you can see my account, and under my runbook, we should have a runbook. Now, why does this have things in it? You should be empty. You're brand new. Okay, I think it's opening a file. So basically, the extension lets you create a directory. Let me put this here. Let me just put it there for now, and I should get a blank file. Cool. So basically, you can change directory and put the local file, the local copy of the runbook, wherever you want on your machine. And as you can see, my runbook is currently open. This is opened what's on Azure locally. So let's go to my code that I wrote earlier, and we'll grab that, put it into the runbook. I can save that, and then if I right click over here, I can publish runbook. Do you want to publish? Yep. And you can see down here, it's been published successfully. And then I can actually even run it. If you can see the mouse, right click on it again, start automation job. I get the option to run in Azure or a hybrid worker group. If I choose hybrid worker group, it'd be like, you didn't make any of those, so what are you saying? So we'll choose Azure, and then it asks if you want to track the job output, which would be really cool, right? It works like 10% of the time for me. Occasionally it does seem to come up and I'm like, this is great. You basically get the output in your PowerShell window, in a new window. Most of the time it doesn't seem to do anything. So we'll go check it out in a second. Let's check out the code that we've got here. Because what we're going to do here is, first thing I want to do is authenticate, right? I created a managed identity for my Azure Runbook. And so I'm going to use connect AZ account with the identity parameter, which uses the identity of the Runbook. Once I do that, I'm basically going to run some PowerShell get AZ disk where it's not managed by anything. So these are just disks that have been forgotten. I'm going to use get AZ network interface to grab NICs that aren't attached to any VMs or anything. And I'm going to get AZ public IP addresses. I've just picked 3 things. There's tons of stuff in Azure that you can programmatically check for, like container registries. You get a certain amount of free storage per container registry. So you can grab how much storage you're using and the SKU you're using and compare those, right? If you've gone over that free storage, you're just paying to store old container versions for no reason. So like check these things on a monthly frequency or something and save your company some money and tell them to put in your bonus check. All right, so after this, we're going to do, this is just PowerShell, right? We're just writing PowerShell code. So some conditional logic to say, if I found things that need cleaning up, I'm going to create an Azure DevOps work item. I can use get AZ access token. This version of AZ Connect, of AZ accounts, is returning a plain text string still, but if you were in state of the shell this morning, you know that has just recently changed. It's fine. Now you've got a secure string. You can just pass that in PowerShell to still be able to create your headers that you need. I've got my organization in Azure DevOps, the project I want to create the work item in, the URL of the post request to create the work item, and then you basically create some JSON of how that work item should look, right? I've got a title and a description with the stuff in. You can add as many fields as you want in your Azure work item, add it to an iteration, tag someone, whatever. The easiest way I've found to do that is to use a GET request to get a ticket that looks like the one you want to create, and then steal this JSON, basically. Because it's really hard to get that right, and it's really frustrating when you're like, okay, go. Nope, that didn't make it. Failed request. And you're trying to pass the JSON, get one that looks how you want it, and then modify it in here. All right, let's check out how it's doing over here. We should have a runbook, Azure Cleanup, and we should have an execution. Uh-oh, it failed. Why did it fail? I didn't give it any permissions, right? I created a managed identity for the runbook, but I didn't actually give it access to anything. And by default, it has access to nothing. So it basically said I couldn't connect with the managed service identity to get AZ disk or to connect to your account. So what we need to do is zoom out a little bit because I've lost my... Over here in the search box, I can say identity. I'm in the runbook. I need to be at the account level, sorry. Identity. And in here, you can see I've got my system identity set up. I can go into Azure Role Assignments and quickly add a role assignment for the subscription. And I'm going to add it to be reader. Cool. Now, when you're adding role assignments, you want them to be as minimal as you can, right? Both on the scope and on the permissions you give. But for this particular task, I want to be able to look for things in my entire subscription. So that's why we've gone for that. While we're doing permissions, we also need to give it permissions to do stuff in Azure DevOps. And I can add a service principal. Here we go, AA PSConf. The service principal name is the name of my Azure Automation account, and I can add it to a project. Now, this will use one of the seats of my Azure DevOps license. You can also use personal access tokens, which you can create up here. For this demo, this was easier. Use whichever fits best with your scenario. But I've now given my managed identity permission to both Azure and Azure DevOps. Let's clear that box out, go back to our runbook. You can also run these directly from the portal. So I'll just click start here. And we should get a new execution down here. It's funny. The buttons you need are always just off the screen. All right, so that's queued up. It's going to run on our Azure runner right in Azure, not on a hybrid runner. And we will wait for this to run. It's queued. This is always going to take longer when I'm stood here rather than like when I'm sat on my couch, but it's not a long runbook, so it won't take too long. You've also got multiple messaging streams across the bottom. You'll notice the exception. That's where we saw the actual message when it was a throw. It was a terminating error, went into the exception. But you've also got output errors, warnings. You can log however much you want. You can also turn on verbose logging for these if you want. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend that be turned on all the time. But let's see. All right, it's moved on to getting disks, which means that it did manage to connect, and it's found the disk of things unattached in my Azure subscription. Cool. You reckon that's got tags? All right, cool. You can see now it's found other things, the nick to nowhere, a forgotten IP, and then it's created the Azure DevOps work item, right? So this is the basically response from that API request. And if we head over to Azure DevOps, refresh this, you can see I've got an Azure cleanup task with today's date. Not the right time, though. What time zone are we in? Cool. And you can see I've got a basic description, right? The only things I added were this title and this description, and the description is pants. It doesn't really tell us anything, right? We had a lot more information because we were working in PowerShell. So I realize I'm almost into the question times, but let me go back to the code because we can make this much better by using the PSHTML module. So I'll just grab that. I'll throw it into my Runbook, save it. I will publish that. Shows us published, and then I'll run it. And while this is running, okay, I tracked the job output. Let's see if we actually get anything. So it starts off as queued, and then you should see it as running, and then it should show exactly the output that we saw in the other one. All right, it's gone to blank. It might be working. It might be working. Cool. All right, we'll come back into here, into our Runbooks, and check out the status. It shows it starting. It's got no output yet. All right, it's connecting. Let's see if it put that into this window. No. Useful. This would be really great if it worked reliably because you don't have to change context a lot, right? The thing that bothers me with this is when you're testing it and you're developing it, you have to change context to see if it worked. But it's all right. It's not that big of a deal. We can pop over here. It shows us completed. We've got our Azure DevOps work item. And if we come over here, we should see a much more beautiful, that is the old one. Click on the new one. A much more beautiful ticket. Cool, look. So because we've got all that information with our Azure PowerShell modules, we might as well use it, right? I've made a summary table at the top, and actually I was supposed to show you the code, but I got distracted. That's never happened before. The top half of the code is exactly the same as the previous one you saw. I then created some CSS, which I probably stole off the internet or had GitHub Copilot right because I'm not a web developer. And then I used PSHTML, the module, to create HTML code. What PSHTML does is it uses a DSL, domain-specific language, to allow you to create HTML code directly from your PowerShell. So this will take a PowerShell object, which is my summary table, and then put all of the little TD, TR, TD, TC, whatever they are, tags around it so that it is presentable HTML. I then can build up the rest of my body using things like H3 to create headings, and then UL, and then looping through to create the bullet points, right? Every disk I have will create a new bullet point in here in my details, basically showing, where is the mouse gone? Why are you so small? Okay. Basically a link to the portal, like that will take me exactly to the resource that I need to delete and some details about it. The size, you could put whatever else you wanted in here. You could grab the tags if they were here. Not only is this documenting things that we might want to clean up, but it's reminding us every month to do this kind of task, right? So, Good news. That was the demos, and we've made it with 5 minutes over of demos because demos are cool. We can head into the question and answer section. Who has a question? Yes, go for it.
It's extremely frustrating to do debugging, programming, testing, because it seems like a lot of hassle.
So the question was, it seems frustrating to do the programming and the troubleshooting and the debugging. Yes and no. So it's just PowerShell code that you're running in a runner somewhere, right? So when I'm developing the PowerShell, I connect to Azure as myself instead of the managed identity. And then I just write the code in my VS Code terminal. So I've written all of that before I've even gone to Azure Automation to basically do the scheduling of it. Yeah. Exactly. So the comment was, first I do the local development, and then once I'm happy with what the code is doing, I put it into Azure Automation. Yeah, exactly. Azure Automation is basically the task scheduler in the cloud where we're going to take our scripts and schedule them. There is some debugging, troubleshooting around getting the permissions right, making sure it has access to stuff. Like obviously if I didn't give it access to Azure DevOps, it would get to the end and it'd be like, I can't create a ticket. I don't know where the project is. So like there's things like that because obviously the authentication is different, but it would be no different than if you scheduled it under a service account. You'd still need to go through that kind of dance of getting it just right? Good question though. Thank you. Any others? Yes.
Azure site recovery. When you need to develop in Azure or in existing VS Code connected to Azure, because you don't have context of Azure site developers without.
Sure. Yeah. So the more of a comment, but like if you need the context of Azure things, then you need to be in Azure to test it. Yeah, for this particular example, and most of the stuff I do is either like hitting API endpoints or using the Azure PowerShell modules. You can do pretty much all that locally, like authenticated as yourself. But yeah, if the context is something where you have to be in Azure, I'm not sure. Even for Azure Site Recovery, you should be able to use the PowerShell modules to interact with that from your local machine, right?
Maybe for some bug, but I don't know for the recovery itself.
Okay, so when you're running the failover jobs, how do you trigger those? In the portal or PowerShell or something? Okay, so I imagine you could do that locally if you had the right authentication, the right permissions, and the right context locally. But yeah, one to test. I'm not sure. Good question. Any other questions? Sure.
A pretty good test environment before you plan in your code, because you now have like two construction sites. First, you're locally code, and second is like Azure Automation to make it properly work. So it's just like extra work when you switch to it.
Yeah, so I would look into the source control. Sorry, the question was like, is this extra work because you're developing locally and then you've got to put it somewhere else? I would look into the source control integration because you can basically commit your changes into source control, go through the PR process there, make sure it's approved, whatever, and then that can be deployed to your runbook. The VS Code extension is really great for me testing against my local tenant, or for you like hacking about and seeing if it's going to work. For the productionized approach, definitely source control and like a control process to get it out there for sure. But yeah, good question. All right, well, I've got questions for you too, because it didn't say which direction the question and answer was. So like, can you think of any tasks that you could automate with Azure Automation right off the bat? Anything? Yeah, it's true, right? I mean, there are so many tasks we do manually or like with a couple scripts that we could wrap in that. But anyone got any good examples or good? Yeah, sure.
Monitoring solutions or resources, maybe like defining thresholds for something and then showing out mails to the application.
Yeah. Cool. So the idea was some kind of like monitoring solution, looking for things hitting disk thresholds or something. Like obviously you could use Azure Monitor or Azure Alerts for stuff like that too. But yeah, you could control maybe where that goes or create tickets for stuff to get actioned or whatever. Yeah, totally. You could use it for that. Yeah. Yeah. Love it. So the idea was documentation, right? Like we could get all of our Azure resource information and then make sure that documentation is up to date. Another great reason to use tags on your resources, because you could use that to drive that documentation piece. Yeah, I love that idea. I'm writing that down. Say that again, sorry. Yes, dormant account reports. Something that goes out and looks for accounts that haven't logged in or haven't accessed anything recently. Create an Azure DevOps ticket. Yeah, nice. Cool. Very good. Any other final questions? Sure. Yes. Yeah, good question. So in here in runtime environments, when I go to create it in the portal, I'm given like a specific list of PowerShell versions I can use. So I'm guessing it is officially supported as far as using it in Azure Automation. But if you have, the question was, is 7.4 officially supported by Microsoft? And my answer is I believe so, because I can use it. But if you've got PowerShell modules that have dependencies on specific versions, then you would need to make sure your runtime environment matches those requirements. Yeah, good question. Sorry. Can you? I'm here. Yeah, but see how small the little hand is? In VS Code, I was like, oh my God, just go to the top. Someone in the back had a question? Yes.
That question in the start. Notice that it's only the 7.2 and 7.4. 7.
Good point. So the comment was, notice the versions that are on here. Whoop. I think it detects when I leave, and then it goes to sleep, so I must stay here for demos. Yeah, the long-term support versions are what are in here, not the, was he calling them short-term support earlier? Stable, yeah, that's right. So those ones are not available in here, so it is the LTS versions, yeah. Good point. Cool. All right, well, that's all I've got for you. That was, oh, yeah, go. That's the best question. Yeah. Is the code available somewhere? Yes, it's all on my GitHub repo. I believe it's public already, but if it's not, I'll make it public right after this. Yeah, pull it down, use it in your environments, clean up your Azure tenants, save some money. Recommended. Do you know what my pet peeve is when people go back to the presentation and they don't put it in presentation mode. So that didn't happen. We can edit the video. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me. Like I said, I'll be here tomorrow. You can catch me tomorrow chatting about Fabric with Rob at 3, I believe, and I'll be around for the rest of the conference if you have questions or whatever. Thank you again. Cheers.